There's a strange feeling that comes up when you read something you weren't really meant to find. Not fear exactly, more like a quiet hesitation. Like your mind slows down on its own, as if it's trying to decide whether to keep going or gently step away. Some texts have that effect, not because they're dramatic or shocking, but because of what they almost say and then don't. The Book of Enoch is one of those texts. It sits just outside what most people are taught, quietly existing in the background of history. Mentioned, debated, translated, then set aside. Not completely erased, but never fully accepted either. And if you stay with it long enough, a question starts to form. Not why it exists, but why it was carefully left out. It's difficult to point to a single moment when the Book of Enoch returned, not because it didn't, but because it never fully disappeared in the first place. For a long time, it existed in a kind of quiet edge space, not hidden exactly. Just not where most people would naturally look, referenced in older writings, quoted in places you wouldn't expect, then just as gently left behind. If you go back far enough, early Christian writers seem to know it well. Some of them spoke about Enoch as if his words carried weight, as if they belonged alongside other sacred texts. There's even a passage in the New Testament, in the Epistle of Jude, that echoes Enoch almost directly, not vaguely, but clearly enough that it doesn't feel like coincidence. And yet, when the structure of the Bible began to settle, Enoch wasn't there, not removed loudly, not debated in a way that left obvious traces, just absent. That absence is where things start to feel a little uncertain, because usually when something is rejected, you can find the reason. A disagreement, a conflict, a clear line where someone decided, this does not belong. But with Enoch, that line feels blurred, almost softened, as if the decision wasn't made all at once, but gradually over time, and that makes it harder to follow. Some historians suggest that Enoch was simply too different. Its language, its imagery, the way it describes the world, it doesn't quite match the tone of other texts that were eventually accepted. There's a heaviness to it. A sense that it's describing something just slightly outside the boundaries people were comfortable with. But even that explanation feels incomplete, because difference alone doesn't always lead to exclusion. There are other texts, equally complex, equally strange in their own way, that were preserved and studied. So the question lingers quietly without demanding an answer. Why this one? As you move through older records, you start to notice something subtle. Mentions of Enoch don't vanish all at once. They thin out, like a voice fading in the distance rather than being cut off. One writer references it, another questions it, a third avoids it altogether. And then, it becomes something people are aware of, but don't engage with directly. That kind of fading feels different from erasure. It feels intentional in a quieter way. There's also the matter of geography, though that comes into focus a little later. For now, it's enough to notice that while some regions slowly let the text drift away, others held on to it, not aggressively. Not as if they were guarding a secret. Just continuing to read it, copy it, pass it along, as if nothing had changed, which creates an interesting contrast. Because if a text disappears in one place but remains in another, it suggests that the decision wasn't universal. It wasn't something everyone agreed on at the same time. It was selective. And selection always carries a human element. It means someone somewhere made a choice, or many small choices layered over time until the outcome felt natural, inevitable even, but inevitability can be misleading. When something unfolds slowly enough, it starts to feel like it couldn't have happened any other way, as if history simply moved in that direction on its own. But if you slow down and look closely, there are always moments where things could have shifted differently. With Enoch, those moments are harder to see. They're not marked by dramatic events or strong declarations. They're quieter than that, subtle adjustments, slight preferences, a text included here, another left out there, until eventually the shape of what remains begins to look complete, even if something is missing. There's another detail that doesn't quite settle easily. Fragments of the Book of Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means that long before any later decisions were made, this text was circulating alongside others that would become deeply important. It wasn't an outsider at the beginning. It was part of the conversation, and that changes the feeling of it just a little, because it suggests that Enoch didn't start on the margins. It moved there, slowly, almost quietly enough that, unless you're paying attention, you might assume it had always been there, but it hadn't. At some point, it stood closer to the center, and then, over time, it didn't. That shift is where the uncertainty deepens, not in a dramatic way, just enough to make you pause. Because when something moves like that, from known to nearly forgotten, it leaves behind a kind of outline, a space you can sense, even if you can't fully see what used to fill it. And the more you sit with that space, the more it starts to feel like a question rather than an accident. Not a loud question, just a quiet one that stays with you longer than expected. There's a tendency, when looking back at history, to imagine decisions as clean and deliberate, as if a group of people sat together, spoke clearly, and reached a firm conclusion that everyone understood, but it rarely happens that way. More often, things shift in ways that feel almost unnoticeable at first. A preference here, a hesitation there, one text read a little less often, another copied a little more carefully, and over time, those small movements begin to matter. With the Book of Enoch, it's possible that no single moment decided its place, no clear rejection, no final statement that said it didn't belong. Instead, it may have been something quieter, a gradual sense that it didn't fit as comfortably as other writings. Not wrong necessarily, just difficult. If you imagine early communities gathering, sharing these texts aloud, you can almost sense the difference. Some writings offer guidance that feels grounded. They move through stories, laws, teachings that connect directly to daily life. Enoch doesn't quite do that. It drifts upward or outward. It speaks of watchers descending, of knowledge being given in ways that feel unusual, almost out of place. Not symbolic in the way people were used to interpreting things, but oddly direct, as if it's describing events without softening them, and that creates a kind of tension. Because when a text feels too literal in its strangeness, it becomes harder to place, harder to explain. People might begin to ask questions that don't have simple answers, questions that lead further than expected, and that's often where hesitation begins, not in fear exactly. More like uncertainty about what happens if those questions continue. There's also the matter of consistency. As different writings were brought together, there was a quiet effort to create something that felt unified, not identical, but aligned enough that the overall message held together. Enoch, in its tone and content, moves differently. It introduces ideas that don't easily connect with other texts, not in an obvious way, at least. It doesn't contradict everything, but it doesn't settle neatly into place either. And over time, that kind of difference can feel disruptive. Not because it's false, but because it's hard to integrate. If you think about it gently, without forcing a conclusion, it starts to feel less like a rejection and more like a slow distancing. A text that people respected, maybe even valued, but weren't quite sure how to hold on to. So they didn't push it out, they just stopped pulling it in, and that subtle shift changes everything. Because once something is no longer actively included, it begins to fade on its own, not immediately, not all at once. But gradually, as new copies aren't made, as fewer people read it, as references become less frequent, it drifts, and drifting is easy to overlook. There's no clear moment to point to, no single decision to question, just a quiet movement away from the center. At the same time, other texts were becoming more stable, more fixed, copied again and again, shared across regions, forming the foundation of what people would come to recognize as scripture. That repetition gives something weight, it makes it feel permanent. And anything outside of that repetition begins to feel less certain, even if it once stood alongside it. There's a kind of natural selection that happens in these situations, but it's shaped by human choices, not always conscious ones, sometimes just habits, preferences. What feels easier to understand, easier to teach, easier to preserve? Enoch doesn't fit easily into those categories. It requires a different kind of attention, a willingness to sit with ideas that don't resolve quickly, and not everyone, especially in a structured setting, is comfortable with that. So the text lingers at the edges, not hidden, just less present, and over time people begin to assume that what remains is all there ever was, which isn't quite true, because traces of Enoch continue to appear even after its presence fades, in references, in echoes, in ideas that feel familiar but slightly out of place, as if they came from somewhere just beyond what's been preserved. Those traces are easy to miss if you're not looking for them. But once you notice them, they create a quiet sense that something is still there, just out of view, not lost entirely, just not fully included. And that distinction matters more than it seems, because something that is lost feels accidental. But something that is left out, even gently, carries a different kind of weight. It suggests a boundary, not a harsh one, just a line drawn softly enough that most people never think to question it, but it's there. And the Book of Enoch rests just on the other side of it, not far away, just slightly beyond what was chosen to remain. When people first open the Book of Enoch, there's often a quiet pause, not because it's difficult to read, but because it doesn't feel the way they expect it to. There's no gentle easing into it, no familiar rhythm that settles the mind. Instead, it begins in a way that feels already in motion, as if something has been happening long before you arrived, and you've stepped into the middle of it without context. That alone creates a certain distance, not discomfort exactly, just a sense that you're slightly out of place. And as you continue, that feeling doesn't fully go away. The structure of the text moves differently. It doesn't unfold like a story with a clear path. It drifts between visions, declarations, moments that feel both symbolic and strangely literal at the same time. You read about the Watchers, beings described not as distant myths but as something closer, present, involved, and the way they're introduced is almost casual, not explained in detail, not defended or justified, just there, which can be unsettling in a quiet way. Because most texts, especially those meant to guide or teach, tend to prepare the reader. They build a framework. They offer context so that what follows can be understood, or at least placed somewhere familiar. Enoch doesn't seem interested in doing that. It speaks as if the reader already knows. Or perhaps as if the reader is expected to accept. That subtle difference changes the experience of reading it. Instead of being led, you're left to follow, and sometimes to catch up. There are passages where the language feels almost heavy with meaning, but not in a clear or structured way. More like something layered, where each sentence carries more than it openly reveals. Not hidden, just not fully explained. And that creates space. Space where interpretation begins to wander. Some readers might take it symbolically, seeing the Watchers as representations of something human: temptation, knowledge, boundaries being crossed. Others might read it more literally, allowing the text to stand as it presents itself without softening its edges. The text doesn't seem to insist either way. It simply continues. That kind of openness can feel unusual, especially when compared to writings that aim to guide the reader toward a specific understanding. Enoch feels less like instruction and more like observation. As if it's describing something that happened or was believed to have happened without pausing to shape how it should be understood. And that leaves a quiet question hanging in the background, not about what it says, but about what it expects from the person reading it. There's also a shift in scale that happens as you move through it. The focus moves beyond the human level fairly quickly. It begins to describe things that feel larger, more distant, almost cosmic in a way that isn't common in other texts of its time. Not poetic, not abstract. Just expanded, and that expansion can feel difficult to hold onto, because when something stretches beyond familiar boundaries, the mind naturally looks for ways to bring it back into something manageable, something that fits, but Enoch doesn't always offer that return. It allows the ideas to remain extended, unresolved. And over time, that can create a kind of quiet fatigue, not from complexity, but from the lack of grounding. The feeling that you're moving through something that doesn't quite anchor itself. That doesn't make it less meaningful. If anything, it might be part of why it was valued by some, but it does make it harder to integrate, harder to place alongside texts that offer clearer direction, clearer structure, clearer meaning. There's also something else, something more subtle, a tone that runs beneath the surface. It's not dramatic, not urgent, but there's a sense of weight to it, as if the text is carrying something that isn't meant to be taken lightly, even if it doesn't explicitly say so. That tone doesn't ask for attention, it simply exists. And the longer you stay with it, the more noticeable it becomes, not in a way that pushes you away, but in a way that makes you aware that you're reading something that doesn't fully settle, something that resists being simplified, and perhaps that's where the difficulty begins. Not in what the text says, but in how it refuses to settle into a single, comfortable meaning. Because when something remains open like that, it invites questions. And questions, especially the kind that don't resolve easily, have a way of lingering longer than answers. As you stay with the text a little longer, something else begins to shift, not in what it says, but in how it feels to keep reading it. At first, it's just unfamiliar. Then, slowly, it becomes something harder to describe. Not confusing exactly, not overwhelming either. Just slightly disorienting in a quiet way, like trying to follow a path that keeps changing direction without warning. There are moments where it feels almost clear, where a passage seems to settle into something understandable. And just as you begin to feel that sense of footing, it moves again. Not abruptly, just enough to unsettle the rhythm. And that rhythm matters more than it seems. Because when people read something regularly, especially something meant to carry meaning or guidance, they begin to rely on a certain flow. A way of moving from one idea to the next that feels steady, predictable, even comforting. Enoch doesn't quite offer that. It shifts between visions and statements in a way that feels less structured, more fluid, perhaps, as if the boundaries between ideas aren't meant to be firm. And that fluidity can make it difficult to hold onto a single thread. You find yourself reading not in a straight line, but in small returns, going back over sentences, not because they're unclear, but because they seem to carry more than they first reveal. There's a kind of density to it, not in the language alone, but in the way each part seems connected to something just beyond what's written. That can create a certain distance between the text and the reader, not a rejection, just a quiet gap. And over time, that gap can grow, especially for those trying to gather these writings into something cohesive, something that can be shared, taught, preserved with clarity. A text that resists clear structure becomes difficult in that context, not because it lacks meaning, but because it holds too many possibilities at once. There's also the way Enoch handles authority, or perhaps how it doesn't. Many texts establish a clear voice, a sense of who is speaking, why they're speaking, and how that voice should be understood. It creates a kind of anchor, something the reader can return to. Enoch feels less anchored. The voice shifts in a way that isn't always easy to follow. At times it feels observational, at other times declarative, and occasionally something in between, as if the boundary between witness and messenger isn't fully defined. That lack of clarity doesn't weaken the text, but it changes how it's received. Because without a steady point of reference, the reader has to do more of the work. They have to decide how to interpret what they're seeing, how to place it within their own understanding, and not everyone is comfortable with that. Especially in a setting where texts are meant to provide guidance, stability, something that can be relied on without too much uncertainty. There's a quiet tension there, between openness and structure, between possibility and clarity, and Enoch leans toward openness. It leaves room, perhaps more room than most are willing to sit with for long. If you imagine this text being read alongside others, you can begin to sense how it might stand apart, not louder, not more important, just less contained. And that lack of containment makes it harder to frame, harder to explain, harder to teach in a consistent way, which does mean it was dismissed, only that it may have been set aside, gently, in favor of something that felt easier to hold on to. There's also a quieter detail that becomes noticeable the longer you think about it. Enoch doesn't seem concerned with being accepted. It doesn't adjust its tone, doesn't soften its edges, doesn't try to meet the reader halfway. It simply presents what it presents and leaves the rest unresolved. That kind of stillness can feel unusual, almost as if the text exists independently of how it's received, and in a way, that might be part of why it lingers in the background of history rather than at its center. Because texts that remain open, that resist being shaped into something fixed, often don't settle into the structures people build around them. They remain slightly outside, not forgotten, just not fully brought in, and over time, that distance becomes part of how they're understood. Not through what they clearly say, but through the quiet space they leave behind, a space that feels unfinished, or perhaps intentionally left that way. There's something almost ordinary about the way important decisions begin, not dramatic, not loud. Just small shifts in attention and what people choose to focus on next. When you look at early religious communities, especially the ones that were trying to preserve teachings in a world that was still forming its identity, you don't find a single governing moment where everything is neatly sorted. Instead, you find ongoing conversations, letters, disagreements that stretch across years without ever fully resolving. And in that kind of environment, texts don't just stay or go. They drift toward whatever structure can hold them most comfortably. The Book of Enoch existed inside that kind of environment for a time, not isolated, not unknown, but moving among other writings that were also being considered, copied, and shared. And at some point, it stopped moving in the same direction, not suddenly, more like a quiet slowing. In historical records, there's no universally agreed-upon moment where a council gathers and explicitly says, "This text must be removed." That idea, while simple, doesn't fully match how things actually unfolded in the early centuries of scriptural formation. Instead, what appears is something more fragmented. Different regions preserving different texts, different leaders emphasizing different traditions, lists forming gradually, changing slightly depending on time and place, and within that gradual shaping, some writings became stable, others didn't. Enoch seems to fall into that second category, but even that description feels too clean. Because it wasn't completely unstable, it was read, it was referenced, it was known, which means its movement away from central inclusion wasn't due to obscurity. It was still visible, just not consistently held, and that difference matters. There's a tendency to imagine these decisions as final, as if a boundary was drawn and everything on one side simply disappeared from view. But in reality, boundaries like that often take time to solidify. And even after they do, older materials can continue to exist just outside of them. Sometimes respected, sometimes questioned, sometimes simply set aside for practicality, because practicality is often underestimated in these kinds of historical shifts. Not everything is removed because it is rejected. Some things are set aside because they are harder to unify with the direction a community is trying to take. And unity, especially in early institutional formation, becomes increasingly important over time. A shared structure allows teaching to be consistent. It allows ideas to be passed down without fragmentation. It creates something stable enough to survive across generations, but stability often comes with narrowing, and narrowing always involves choice. Even if those choices are gradual, even if no one person fully controls them, with Enoch, the challenge may not have been disagreement alone, but how it fit within an emerging framework that was slowly becoming more defined. Some texts naturally aligned with that framework. Their tone, their structure, their themes, they reinforced what was becoming standard. Enoch, however, doesn't seem to align in the same way, not because it contradicts everything, but because it expands in directions that are harder to integrate into a unified structure. And when something expands too widely, it becomes difficult to hold within a single interpretive system. So over time, it becomes less central, not removed, just less necessary for the structure that is forming. There's also another layer to this process that often goes unnoticed. Preservation is not only about importance, it is also about repetition. Texts that are copied more often naturally survive more easily. Those used in teaching become more widespread. Those included in liturgical or communal reading become reinforced through constant use, and repetition creates durability. Enoch, depending on region and tradition, didn't always enter that cycle consistently. So while it remained known in some circles, in others it slowly fell outside of the most repeated structures. And once repetition decreases, visibility begins to fade, not instantly, but steadily. Until eventually, what remains feels less like an active exclusion and more like an absence that formed over time. There's a subtle but important difference there. Exclusion suggests a decisive break, absence suggests a gradual drift, and history often moves more through drift than break. So when later generations look back and notice that Enoch is not part of the finalized canon in most traditions, it can appear as though a clear decision was made at a single point, but the reality feels more layered, more distributed, more human in a way that is harder to summarize cleanly, because no single voice seems fully responsible for the outcome. Instead, it is shaped by many small decisions, across time, across regions, across shifting priorities. And by the time those decisions settle into something recognizable as a canon, the earlier diversity of texts feels distant, not erased, just no longer centered, and Enoch remains in that distance, still present in fragments, references, and preserved traditions, but no longer at the core of the structure that eventually formed around it, not because it disappeared, but because the center slowly moved elsewhere. The harder part to understand is not that some texts move to the edge, but that, over time, the edge starts to feel natural. As if it was always meant to be there. When something is no longer part of daily use, it doesn't vanish all at once. It simply stops being reinforced, and what isn't reinforced begins to soften in memory, even if the physical copies still exist. In the case of early scripture formation, this softening happened across generations, not in a single lifetime, not through a single decision, but through repeated acts of selection that didn't always feel like selection at the time. A teacher chooses one text over another for clarity. A community adopts a reading tradition that feels more stable. A leader emphasizes certain writings because they align more cleanly with emerging doctrine. None of these actions are dramatic on their own, but together they reshape the landscape of what remains central. And in that shifting landscape, Enoch gradually becomes less visible in mainstream usage, not erased from existence, just less frequently carried forward. There's something important in that distinction, because when people imagine removal, they often picture force, a decisive action that cuts something away. But what actually happens more often is substitution. One text becomes more useful for instruction, so it is used more. Another becomes less practical, so it is used less. And usefulness over time can quietly determine survival. This doesn't necessarily reflect judgment on truth or value. It reflects what can be maintained, repeated, and shared consistently across different communities. And consistency is powerful. Once a shared structure begins to form, deviation becomes more noticeable. Not necessarily wrong, but different enough to stand apart. Enoch, with its layered visions and less linear structure, doesn't naturally settle into that kind of consistency. It asks for a different kind of engagement, one that is slower, more interpretive, less anchored to direct instruction. And that makes it harder to standardize, not impossible. Just less efficient in a system moving toward uniformity, so it drifts further into the background. Meanwhile, the texts that align more directly with teaching frameworks become more central. They are easier to reference, easier to memorize, easier to translate into communal practice. And once something becomes easier to transmit, it naturally becomes more dominant. Over time, dominance can look like exclusivity, even if it began as preference. There's also the influence of translation and transmission itself. As texts move across languages and regions, subtle shifts occur, not always intentional. Sometimes it is simply the nature of copying by hand or interpreting unfamiliar phrases through the lens of local understanding. And in that process, texts that are already less frequently used are more vulnerable to variation, omission, or fragmentation, not because they are targeted, but because they are less stabilized through repetition, so their presence becomes uneven. In some places, Enoch remains known, preserved, read with interest, even reverence. In others, it becomes a reference point rather than an active text, something mentioned but not deeply engaged with, and that unevenness matters. Because over long periods of time, uneven presence can begin to feel like absence, not because it is gone everywhere, but because it is no longer reliably found in the same way. By the time formal canons begin to solidify in later centuries, much of this earlier diversity has already been reshaped by practice. The decisions that appear formal on paper often reflect patterns that had already formed through long usage. So what looks like exclusion from a single moment is often the result of accumulated drift, small shifts that became structure, and structure, once established, tends to feel permanent, even if its formation was anything but sudden. Enoch then doesn't disappear so much as it recedes from the central thread that later traditions hold onto. It continues to exist at the edges of memory, preserved in certain communities, rediscovered in later centuries, studied again with curiosity and caution. But it no longer occupies the same shared space it once did, and that change is not marked by a single line. It is marked by time, slow, layered time, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It simply moves things until one day what was once alongside everything else is now standing just slightly apart, not lost, not erased, just no longer part of the center that history chose to carry forward. There are places where history doesn't feel like it was written so much as preserved against forgetting. Ethiopia is often described that way when people begin tracing the path of the Book of Enoch. Not because it is mysterious in a dramatic sense, but because it held onto certain texts long after other regions had moved in different directions. And Enoch is one of those texts, What makes this part of the story feel different is the sense of continuity. While many traditions gradually narrowed their collections of writings, Ethiopian Christian tradition maintained a broader canon for a much longer time, not as a reaction against others, but as part of its own unfolding history. And in that continuity, Enoch remained present, not hidden, not rediscovered later, simply present. That alone changes the way the story feels, because instead of a text that vanished and returned, you start to see a text that never fully left in certain places. It continued to be copied, continued to be read, continued to exist within a living tradition that treated it as meaningful rather than questionable. And that raises a quiet question in the background, not about whether it is true or false, but about how different histories can hold different versions of what is considered important. In many parts of the world, as religious texts were being standardized, boundaries were becoming clearer. What was included became more defined. What was excluded became more settled. But in Ethiopia, the process didn't mirror that shift in the same way. Instead, there was a different rhythm at work. One shaped by translation history, regional development, and early adoption of certain texts before later standardizations became dominant elsewhere. And once a text becomes part of early liturgical and cultural life, it doesn't simply fade when external standards change. It remains embedded in language, in practice, in memory. That's part of why Enoch survives there in full form, preserved in Ge'ez manuscripts that continue a much older tradition of reading. And those manuscripts don't present it as an anomaly. They present it as part of a wider spiritual landscape, not something separate, something integrated. That difference is subtle but important, because it shows that the status of a text is not always universal. It can shift depending on where you stand, which tradition you inherit, and which historical path shaped your access to it. So while in some contexts Enoch becomes apocryphal, in others it never fully leaves the category of accepted reading. And that dual existence creates a kind of tension in the modern understanding of it. A text that is simultaneously familiar and unfamiliar, depending on which historical line you follow. There are also practical reasons why Ethiopia preserved such texts. The early adoption of Christianity there, along with the translation of scriptures into Ge'ez relatively early in its history, meant that certain writings were already embedded before later canonical narrowing became widespread elsewhere. Once that embedding happened, it became part of a stable tradition rather than something that needed constant reevaluation. And stability, once achieved, has its own momentum. It resists revision not through force, but through continuity. There's also something quiet in the way these manuscripts survived. They were not necessarily treated as controversial documents needing protection. They were treated as part of a broader scriptural heritage, so they were copied, handled, passed down, not with urgency, but with routine care. And sometimes that kind of routine preservation is more powerful than any deliberate attempt to save something from disappearance, because it doesn't rely on awareness of loss. It simply continues what has already been established. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the same text gradually becomes less present in mainstream transmission. Not because it was actively removed everywhere, but because it no longer occupied the same central role in evolving traditions. And so the contrast emerges. One tradition continues reading it, others slowly set it aside, and both trajectories unfold without necessarily contradicting each other. They are simply different lines of historical development, but when they are seen together from a distance, they create the impression of divergence, a text that stayed and a text that receded. That is where the modern sense of hidden knowledge often begins to form, even if the reality is more about parallel preservation than concealment. Still, the feeling remains. Because when something exists fully in one tradition and partially in others, it naturally invites questions about how those differences came to be, not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a human one, how memory is shaped, how transmission works, how certain texts remain living in some places while becoming historical artifacts in others. And Enoch sits quietly inside that question, not explaining itself, not defending its place, just continuing to exist where it was never fully set aside, still read, still copied, still present. What stands out most when you look closely at how the Book of Enoch survives in Ethiopia is how unforced it feels. There's no sense of it being rescued from disappearance, no dramatic recovery, no rediscovery after centuries of silence. It's simply there. As part of a longer chain of reading, copying, and teaching that never fully broke. And that changes the emotional weight of the story, because in most narratives people hear about lost or hidden texts, there is usually a moment of absence followed by a moment of return. A gap that gets filled later, but with Enoch in this context, the gap never fully forms in the same way. Instead, the continuity remains intact. And continuity has a way of making things feel ordinary again, even when they are unusual from an outside perspective. Within Ethiopian manuscript traditions, texts like Enoch were not treated as anomalies needing justification. They were part of a broader scriptural environment that included writings preserved in a form different from what became standard elsewhere. And when something is consistently part of reading practice, it doesn't carry the same weight of controversy. It becomes familiar through repetition. That familiarity matters more than people often realize. Because what feels normal in one tradition can feel missing in another, simply due to the paths those traditions took over time. There's also the role of translation history here, which quietly shaped everything that followed. The early translation of scriptures into Ge'ez created a foundation where certain texts entered the cultural and religious landscape at an early stage. Once that happened, they weren't just documents anymore. They became part of how religious understanding was formed and transmitted locally. And once texts are woven into teaching structures, removing them later is not a simple act. It would require more than agreement. It would require disruption of established practice. So instead, they remain, not as preserved relics, but as living parts of a tradition that continues to read them. That distinction is subtle but important, because preservation in this sense is not about saving something from loss. It is about never letting it leave the system in the first place. Meanwhile, in other regions, the process of canon formation moved in a different direction. As theological frameworks became more standardized, certain texts were emphasized while others became less central. This wasn't necessarily a rejection of every excluded writing. It was more about shaping a shared core that could be consistently used across growing and diverse communities. And Enoch, with its unusual structure and expansive visions, simply didn't settle into that shared core in the same way. So it existed in parallel streams, present in one tradition, marginal or absent in others. And over time, those parallel streams became what we now recognize as different canons, different scriptural boundaries, different inherited understandings. But from the perspective of history itself, there was never a single unified moment where everything diverged cleanly. It happened gradually, through geography, through language, through repeated use. Through what was copied more often and what was copied less. And that slow divergence is what creates the modern sense of contrast, not a sudden separation, but a long unfolding. There's also something almost understated about how texts like Enoch were treated in the Ethiopian tradition. They were not framed as controversial or defended against outside critique in the way modern discussions sometimes assume. They were simply part of what was read, which suggests something important about how meaning is shaped. Sometimes the significance of a text is not determined by debate, but by continuity of use, by whether it remains embedded in practice long enough to become unquestioned within that context. And Enoch did. That continuity gives it a different kind of stability. Not the stability of global consensus, but the stability of uninterrupted tradition. And that is why it still exists in full form there, rather than surviving only in fragments or references. It was never fully removed from its own line of transmission. So when people today encounter it and frame it as lost or hidden, they are often seeing it from the perspective of one historical pathway, not all of them. From another pathway, it never disappeared at all. It simply continued along a different route, and both routes are real. They just don't always overlap neatly, which leaves us with a quiet realization. Sometimes, what feels like a mystery is not the result of something being hidden, but the result of different histories carrying different pieces forward. And standing in between those histories, the Book of Enoch feels less like an anomaly, and more like a text that simply traveled differently, still present, still read, still part of a living tradition that never stopped holding on to it. There's a strange thing that happens when you try to translate something that was never fully meant to settle into another language. It doesn't just change words, it changes weight. The Book of Enoch carries that kind of tension inside it, especially when you start thinking about how it moved across languages over centuries. Hebrew influence, Aramaic fragments, later preservation in Ge'ez, and then much later, translations into modern languages that most people read today. Each step adds clarity in one direction and uncertainty in another, because translation is never only about accuracy. It's also about what the translator understands the text to be doing, and that understanding quietly shapes everything. In earlier stages of transmission, scribes weren't just copying words. They were carrying meaning across time, and meaning is slippery. It shifts depending on theological context, cultural expectation, even the purpose of the community reading it. So when a text like Enoch moves through different linguistic worlds, it doesn't arrive unchanged. It arrives interpreted. Not necessarily altered in a dramatic way, more like slightly reframed. Certain phrases gain emphasis, others soften. Some concepts become clearer simply because the translator has a framework for them. Others become more distant because they don't fit easily into the conceptual structure of the new language. And over time, those small adjustments accumulate. There's also the issue of what survives physically. Not all versions of ancient texts remain complete. Some exist in fragments. Some are reconstructed from multiple sources. And when a text is pieced together like that, gaps become part of the reading experience, whether intended or not. With Enoch, parts of the text are known through different manuscript traditions, but not all lines are preserved equally across time. That alone introduces subtle variation in how it is understood, because what is missing can influence interpretation just as much as what is present. A missing passage doesn't feel like absence in a neutral sense. It feels like a pause, a space the reader tries to fill, even unconsciously. And different translators in different eras fill that space differently, sometimes with caution, sometimes with theological alignment, sometimes with simply the closest available phrasing that feels stable enough to carry forward. None of this is unusual in ancient textual transmission. It is actually quite common. But with a text like Enoch, which already sits at the edge of different traditions, these shifts become more noticeable. Because the text itself doesn't always guide interpretation in a single direction. It leaves room, and room invites variation. There's also a quieter layer here that often goes unnoticed. Language carries worldview inside it, not just vocabulary but structure. The way ideas are organized, how relationships between concepts are expressed, what is assumed, and what must be stated explicitly. So when Enoch moves from one linguistic system to another, it doesn't just get translated. It gets reorganized in subtle ways. A concept that feels immediate in one language might become more abstract in another. A vision that feels concrete in one tradition might feel symbolic in another. And none of these shifts are necessarily distortions. They are reflections of how language itself frames understanding. This is part of why ancient texts often feel layered, not because they were intentionally obscure, but because they passed through many interpretive filters before reaching modern readers. Each filter adds clarity in some areas and softness in others. Over centuries, that creates a text that feels both familiar and slightly out of reach at the same time. There's also the role of expectation. Modern readers often approach texts like Enoch with questions already in mind. Questions about angels, about forbidden knowledge, about hidden history. And those expectations influence what stands out during reading. But earlier readers may not have approached it with those same frameworks. For them, it may have been part of a broader spiritual literature where visions, symbolic beings, and cosmic structures were more integrated into how reality was understood. So the same text can feel radically different depending on the interpretive environment surrounding it. That difference is important, because it means meaning is not only inside the text, it also exists in how the text is held. And when Enoch is held differently across time and tradition, its meaning naturally appears unstable from a modern perspective, not because it is unclear, but because it has been carried through multiple ways of understanding. Translation, in this sense, becomes more than linguistic conversion. It becomes a kind of historical layering. Each layer preserves something, but also reshapes it slightly. And after enough layers, the original voice of the text doesn't disappear, but it becomes harder to isolate, not lost, just distributed across time. And Enoch, moving through these layers, ends up existing in a space where every reading is partly the text itself and partly the history of how it was carried. And at a certain point, you start to wonder if there ever really is a pure version of a text like this. Not in the sense of doubt about its existence, but in the sense that every version you encounter has already passed through someone's hands, someone's language, someone's understanding of what it was trying to say. With Enoch, that question becomes harder to ignore. Because even the versions we consider old are still, in a way, downstream from earlier movement, copies of copies, translations of earlier translations, fragments preserved where other parts didn't survive as clearly, and somewhere in that long chain, small shifts stop feeling small. They begin to feel like texture. The Book of Enoch, especially in its Ge'ez tradition, carries that kind of texture strongly. It reads like something that has lived inside language for a very long time, adapting slightly to each stage without ever fully resetting to a single original form that we can point to with certainty. That doesn't make it unreliable, it just makes it layered, and layers are difficult for the mind to simplify. There's also a quiet tension between oral and written transmission that sits underneath all of this. Even when texts are written down, they often exist alongside oral familiarity, read aloud, remembered, paraphrased, retold. In that kind of environment, precision is not always the primary goal. Continuity is. What matters is that the idea continues to live within the community, not that every word remains frozen in place. So when writing and oral tradition interact, the text becomes something slightly fluid, not unstable, but flexible enough to survive different contexts, and that flexibility leaves traces. Sometimes a phrase shifts emphasis over time. Sometimes a description becomes more symbolic in one era and more literal in another. Sometimes a concept is explained more clearly in one translation, simply because the translator is working within a different intellectual framework. None of this is unusual in ancient literature. But with Enoch, the accumulation of these small shifts becomes more visible because of how widely the text has moved between different traditions. There's also something subtle about how authority forms around translated texts. Once a translation becomes widely used, it doesn't just reflect the original. It begins to shape how the original is understood. Readers start to treat the translated version as the stable reference point, even when older versions exist in parallel. Over time, that reference point becomes what feels real. And everything else feels like variation. But variation is not necessarily deviation. It can also be evidence of earlier complexity that has been simplified through transmission. In the case of Enoch, this complexity shows up in the way different traditions preserve different emphases. Some focus more on its visionary structure, others on its moral and cosmological framing. Others still treat it as historical or symbolic literature, depending on the interpretive lens available at the time. And each lens brings out something different, which means the text is never fully exhausted by one reading. There's always something slightly left over. Something that doesn't fully resolve into a single interpretation. And that leftover space is where most of the modern fascination tends to form. Because when a text refuses to fully stabilize in meaning across time and language, it begins to feel like it is holding something just beyond reach. Not hidden in a deliberate sense, but dispersed across its many forms. Translation, then, becomes less about retrieving a fixed original and more about navigating a living archive of meaning that has shifted shape repeatedly. And in that process, the idea of a single authentic version starts to feel less certain, not because authenticity doesn't matter, but because the path back to it is no longer linear. It is layered with interpretation, geography, tradition, and time, and Enoch sits inside all of that quietly. Not insisting on one reading, not resisting others, just continuing to exist across versions that each carry a slightly different sense of what it is, and what it might have been, and what it still is becoming in the act of being read again. There's a point in Enoch where the mind naturally slows down, almost without permission. It's when the text stops behaving like something you are reading and starts feeling more like something you are moving through, not line by line in a simple sense, but step by step through ideas that don't fully sit still. The watchers are usually where this shift becomes most noticeable, not because they are the most dramatic part of the text, but because of how quietly they are introduced. There is no long explanation of who they are supposed to be in a modern, structured sense. No careful framing to prepare the reader for what follows. They simply appear within the narrative space of the text, already in motion, already part of a larger unfolding. And that creates a very particular kind of uncertainty, because when something is introduced without preparation, the mind has to decide how to hold it on its own. The watchers are described as beings who observe, who descend, who interact with humanity in ways that shift the direction of the story. Their actions are not presented as abstract symbolism in the way modern readers might expect from allegorical writing. They feel immediate in the way they are described. And that immediacy is part of what makes the text so difficult to place into a single interpretive category, because it doesn't consistently behave like metaphor, but it also doesn't fully behave like straightforward narrative history. It exists somewhere in between those expectations. And that in-between space is uncomfortable for structured reading systems. There's also the way responsibility is framed within these passages, not in a modern moral sense, but in a cause and effect unfolding where knowledge, interaction, and consequence are tightly linked. The watchers are not simply observers in a passive sense. Their presence is tied to change, and that change carries weight throughout the narrative. But the text does not pause to explain that weight in a reflective way. It simply continues, which leaves interpretation open, and open interpretation always expands in multiple directions at once. Some readers may see symbolic meaning in the watchers, representing boundaries of knowledge or transformation in human understanding. Others may read the text more literally, engaging with it as a record of events described within its own worldview, without translating it into modern categories. And the text itself does not fully resolve this tension. It allows both readings to exist at the same time. That dual possibility is part of what makes it persist in discussion across centuries, because it refuses to collapse neatly into one interpretive layer. There's also a subtle shift in scale that happens when the watchers appear. The narrative moves between human experience and something larger than it, without always marking the transition clearly. One moment feels grounded. The next expands outward into something more cosmic, more layered, less anchored to familiar reference points. And that movement can feel disorienting, not in a chaotic way, but in a way that gently stretches the boundaries of how the reader is used to processing meaning. It asks for a different kind of attention, not analytical speed, but sustained presence. And that kind of reading is not always easy to maintain, especially when the text does not offer clear pauses or structural breaks to reset interpretation. So instead, the mind does what it usually does in such situations. It tries to stabilize what it can. It looks for patterns, for anchors, for familiar structures to hold onto while moving through unfamiliar descriptions. But Enoch doesn't always provide those anchors in the way more structured writings might. It allows the instability to remain, and that is part of its lasting complexity. Because when instability is not resolved, it doesn't disappear. It lingers in memory. The watchers, in that sense, become less a fixed concept and more a kind of interpretive pressure point within the text, a place where meaning is constantly being negotiated, even long after the reading has ended. And that negotiation never fully settles. It just continues quietly, each time the text is revisited. And if you stay with the idea of the watchers a little longer, something else begins to appear underneath it, not another layer of explanation. More like a question that never fully gets spoken out loud. Why does this part of the text feel so different in tone compared to so many other early writings that tried to explain the world in spiritual terms? There are other ancient traditions that speak of beings between realms or messengers or observers, but they usually move towards structure. They define roles more carefully. They create boundaries that help the reader understand where one category ends and another begins. Enoch doesn't always do that. Or at least it doesn't do it in a way that feels complete. The watchers are present, described with a kind of narrative clarity, but without the stabilizing framework that later readers often expect. There's action, consequence, and unfolding events, but not always the kind of interpretive guidance that would settle how those events should be understood. And that absence of explanation becomes its own kind of signal. Because when a text doesn't fully define its own boundaries, the reader naturally starts building those boundaries internally, quietly, almost automatically. Different traditions did exactly that over time. Some leaned toward symbolic interpretation, reading the watchers as part of a moral or cosmological teaching structure. Others treated them more literally within the framework of their own worldview, allowing the narrative to remain closer to its original form without translating it into abstract categories. And neither approach fully resolves the tension. They simply shape it differently. There's also something important in how consequence is handled in these passages. It doesn't feel segmented into neat moral lessons. Instead, consequence unfolds as part of the same continuous movement as the events themselves. The actions and outcomes are closely tied together, without a clear pause where the text steps back to interpret what just happened. That creates a sense of momentum, not urgency, but continuity, one event flowing into another without a formal break in meaning. And that continuity can make interpretation feel less like analysis and more like participation. The reader is not just observing from a distance, but following a sequence that doesn't pause long enough to fully categorize itself. Over time, that can feel slightly destabilizing, especially when compared with texts that offer clearer structural guidance. because structure gives the mind places to rest, and Enoch, particularly in these sections, offers fewer of those resting points. Instead, it sustains movement. There's also the way knowledge is treated within the narrative, not as something purely abstract, but as something that carries weight once it enters the human sphere. The interaction between different realms of understanding is not described in simple oppositions like allowed or forbidden in a modern sense, but in a more unfolding chain of events where knowledge and consequence are deeply entangled, and that entanglement resists simplification. Because once knowledge becomes part of the narrative, it cannot easily be separated from its effects. That creates a kind of tension that runs quietly through the text, not as warning, but as structure, and that structure doesn't always resolve in a clear direction, which may be part of why later readers found it difficult to fully integrate into more standardized frameworks of interpretation, not because it lacked meaning, but because its meaning didn't narrow itself easily into a single interpretive path. Instead, it stayed slightly open. And openness over long periods of transmission tends to shift how a text is positioned within tradition. It can be preserved, it can be referenced, but it doesn't always become central in systems that prefer tighter definition. And so, over time, the Watchers remain one of the most discussed parts of the text, not because they are fully defined, but because they are. They sit in that space where interpretation never fully settles, and each return to the text brings that same subtle uncertainty back again. Not as confusion, but as something unfinished, something that continues to ask for attention without ever fully closing the question it raises. There's a quiet shift that happens when you stop trying to decide whether something is forbidden in the way modern language makes it sound, and instead start asking what people were trying to protect when they drew boundaries in the first place. The Book of Enoch sits right inside that tension, not loudly, not in a confrontational way, more like a text that keeps appearing at the edge of conversations about knowledge, then stepping back again before anyone fully settles on what to do with it. The phrase forbidden knowledge gets attached to it often in modern discussion, but that framing doesn't fully match how older traditions seem to approach it. In many early contexts, knowledge itself isn't treated as dangerous in a simple sense. It's treated as something that has placement, timing, appropriateness within a structure of understanding that is still being formed. So the question becomes less about prohibition and more about context. When is something meant to be understood in a certain way? And what happens when it's encountered outside that structure? Enoch doesn't really answer that question directly. Instead, it presents material that feels like it exists slightly ahead of interpretive systems that would later try to categorize it more firmly. And that creates distance, not rejection, just distance between the text and the frameworks that attempt to hold it. There are passages that deal with knowledge in ways that feel tightly connected to consequence, but not in a simplified moral sense. It's not just this is allowed or this is not allowed. It feels more like a chain reaction, where certain forms of understanding naturally lead into shifts in reality, perception, or order. And once that chain is in motion, the text doesn't step back to separate cause from effect in a clean instructional way. It continues forward. That kind of structure can feel unusual when compared to texts that are designed for clearer teaching patterns, because teaching structures often rely on segmentation, idea, explanation, conclusion, or command, interpretation, application. Enoch doesn't consistently segment itself like that. It flows, and flow resists simple categorization. So when later readers try to place it into a framework of permitted and restricted knowledge, they are often doing something the text itself doesn't fully support in a straightforward way. That doesn't mean those categories are meaningless. It just means they may not originate from the text itself in a direct sense. They may be applied to it later as interpretive tools. There's also something important about how ancient communities tended to think about boundaries of knowledge in general. Boundaries were often not about hiding information, but about guiding how it should be received. Certain ideas required preparation. Certain teachings required context. Without that, meaning could become unstable or misunderstood. So what looks like restriction from a modern perspective might have originally functioned more like sequencing. Not you cannot know this, but this belongs here, not there. And when texts move outside their original sequencing environment, interpretation naturally shifts, because the supporting structure is no longer fully present. That's part of what happens with Enoch across different traditions. It is read in some places within a continuous framework where its ideas are already integrated. In others, it is encountered as something outside the established sequence, which changes how it is perceived. And that difference in placement can completely change the emotional tone of reading it. What feels integrated in one context can feel disruptive in another, not because the text itself has changed, but because the surrounding structure has. There's also a quiet irony in how modern discussions often elevate the idea of forbidden knowledge as if it implies secrecy or suppression, when in many historical contexts the concern was more about coherence, how ideas fit together, how they are transmitted, how they remain stable across time. Enoch doesn't resist coherence, but it doesn't always align itself in a way that makes coherence simple within later standardized systems, so it remains slightly outside, not hidden, not erased, just not fully absorbed into the structures that came to define what was considered central. And that position between inclusion and distance is often where the idea of forbidden begins to form in later interpretation, even if originally it may not have been about prohibition at all, just placement, just timing, just the way knowledge moves when it passes through different layers of understanding over time. There's a moment, if you sit with these kinds of texts long enough, where the word forbidden starts to feel less like a description and more like a lens, something people place over the past, not something the past always used for itself. Because the more you look at Enoch in its historical setting, the more it feels like it was never treated as a sealed object. It was read, copied, referenced, and preserved in certain traditions without the sense that it was locked away from understanding. And yet in other contexts, it slowly drifted outside the main current of what was regularly used. Both things are true at once, and that overlap is where modern interpretations often begin to simplify. We tend to want a clear category, included or excluded, accepted or rejected, safe or forbidden. But historical transmission rarely behaves in that clean way. Instead, it moves in layers of familiarity. Some texts stay close to the center because they are repeatedly used in teaching, liturgy, or shared interpretation. Others remain known but less frequently activated in those same settings. And over time, that difference in usage can harden into perceived categories. So something that was once simply less central can later feel like it was intentionally placed outside, even if no single moment of exclusion exists in a clear, documented form. Enoch seems to sit inside that transformation. Not as an exception to history, but as an example of how memory reorganizes itself across generations. There's also a subtle psychological effect that happens when a text survives unevenly across traditions. The mind starts filling in the gaps. If one tradition preserves a text fully and another doesn't emphasize it as strongly, the absence can begin to feel meaningful on its own, not necessarily as evidence of removal, but as a space that invites interpretation. And interpretation rarely stays neutral for long. It begins to suggest intention, patterns, reasons, even when the underlying reality may simply be difference in transmission pathways. That's where the modern idea of hidden knowledge often forms, not always from concealment, but from asymmetry, from the fact that not all traditions carried the same material forward in the same way. And Enoch, preserved fully in some lines and partially in others, becomes a natural focal point for that kind of asymmetry. But if you step back a little, the picture becomes less about secrecy and more about divergence. Different communities, different priorities, different textual environments shaping what remained central. There's also something important in how knowledge feels when it is no longer uniformly shared. Even if it was never hidden, the simple fact that it is not equally present everywhere can make it feel like it belongs to a different category. That emotional shift is subtle, but powerful. It turns variation into significance, distance into meaning, and that meaning then becomes part of how the text is discussed in later centuries. So when people describe Enoch as containing forbidden knowledge, what they are often reacting to is not a historical act of suppression, but a long gap in shared familiarity, a gap created gradually through different lines of transmission that didn't fully converge. And once that gap exists, it becomes easy for imagination to fill it with intent, but the more grounded reading suggests something quieter, not secrecy, not prohibition, just uneven continuity. Some traditions carried it forward fully, others moved in different directions, emphasizing other texts that better fit their developing frameworks. And over time, those paths became distinct enough that what was once part of a broader shared landscape now feels divided, which brings us back to the Book of Enoch itself. It doesn't really present itself as hidden. It doesn't behave like something waiting to be discovered. It behaves like something that has always been moving through different environments, adapting differently depending on where it was carried. And in that sense, it is less a mystery of concealment and more a record of divergence, still present, still readable. Just no longer sitting in the same center for every tradition that once knew it. There's a kind of quiet pattern you only notice when you stop looking at what was removed and start looking at what stayed, not in one place but across many. The Book of Enoch becomes interesting in that way because its story isn't really about disappearance. It's about uneven survival, Some texts move through history like steady rivers, always present in the same channels, even if the banks change slightly over time. Others branch out, split, flow through different landscapes, sometimes rejoining, sometimes not. Enoch feels like one of those branching currents. In certain traditions, it remains fully present, read and copied as part of a continuous heritage. In others, it exists more as a reference point, something known but not regularly centered in practice or teaching. And that difference, when stretched across centuries, starts to look like absence from one perspective, even though it is simply continuity in another. There's a subtle psychological effect that comes with that kind of divergence. When you encounter a text that exists fully in one tradition and only partially in another, the mind tends to assign meaning to the difference, not always consciously, but in a quiet way that shapes interpretation. If something is not equally visible everywhere, it begins to feel like it must have been intentionally positioned that way, not because there is evidence of that intention, but because asymmetry invites explanation, and explanation often turns into narrative. Over time, that narrative can solidify into ideas of suppression or concealment, even when the historical reality may be far more gradual and less centralized. What actually appears in the record is something more distributed. Different communities making different decisions about what to emphasize in teaching, what to copy more frequently, what to integrate into liturgical life, and what to leave in a more peripheral role. None of these decisions require coordination across a single authority. They can emerge independently, shaped by local needs, theological priorities, and practical considerations of transmission. And once those local decisions accumulate over time, the overall landscape of preserved texts begins to look uneven. But uneven is not the same as erased. It's just different pathways of continuity. There's also the role of language again, quietly influencing what remains stable. Texts that are frequently translated across languages tend to stabilize in certain forms. Those that move through fewer active translation cycles may remain more regionally anchored, preserving older linguistic layers but becoming less widespread in newer interpretive environments. Enoch exists in both conditions at different points in its history, which means its visibility changes depending on where and when you are looking. That alone can create the impression of fluctuation in importance, even when the text itself has not fundamentally changed within its own tradition. And when modern readers encounter those differences side by side, it can feel like something has been lost in one place and preserved in another. But from another angle, it is simply parallel development. Different branches of the same early textual world moving in different directions without a single controlling center. There's also something important about how memory behaves in religious and historical contexts. Memory tends to favor continuity within a community over completeness across all communities. What matters most is what is consistently present in the shared life of a group, not necessarily what exists elsewhere. So over time, each tradition develops its own stable core of texts, reinforced through repetition and practice. And once those cores are established, they feel complete from within. Even if other cores exist elsewhere with different contents, that sense of completeness is powerful. It creates stability, identity, coherence, but it also naturally narrows the perceived scope of what is central. so texts outside that core begin to feel secondary, even if they were once shared more broadly. Enoch, in this sense, becomes part of a larger pattern in which early textual diversity gradually organizes itself into multiple stable but separate traditions, not through removal, but through consolidation, and consolidation always involves selection, not necessarily conscious exclusion, but repeated preference over time. The result is a landscape where certain texts remain universally recognized within a tradition, while others remain regionally or historically preserved. And when those landscapes are compared later, the differences can look more dramatic than they felt during the actual process of formation, because hindsight compresses time. It turns gradual change into apparent turning points. So what looks like disappearance may actually be long-term reorganization, and what looks like secrecy may simply be uneven continuity. Enoch sits quietly inside that reorganization, still present in some lines, less central in others, but never fully broken from its own transmission history, just carried differently, depending on which branch of the story you are standing on. There's a point where looking at all of this from a distance starts to feel less like solving something and more like watching how things naturally settle over time, not in a neat way, more like just slowly choosing where to rest. When you place Enoch back into that wider movement of early texts, what becomes clearer is that nothing around it really behaves like a single coordinated system. There isn't one center deciding everything. There are many centers, loosely connected, each shaping what survives in its own way. And that changes the entire feeling of the mystery, because mysteries usually assume intention, but what you often see here is accumulation. Small decisions repeated across generations until they start to look like structure. Some texts are read more often because they fit more smoothly into teaching. Some are copied more frequently because they are already part of local tradition. Some are preserved because they are embedded early enough that removing them would feel unnecessary or disruptive. None of that requires a single moment of exclusion. It just requires time. And time is enough to reorganize almost anything. There's also something subtle about how visibility works across centuries. A text doesn't need to vanish completely to feel absent later. It only needs to stop being equally present everywhere. Once that happens, perception begins to shift. From this exists in some places to this is missing in many places. And that shift is not purely factual. It's interpretive. It reflects how humans naturally compare uneven information. So when modern readers encounter Enoch preserved fully in one tradition and partially or less centrally in others, the mind instinctively looks for a reason that explains the difference in a single direction. But history rarely offers single-direction explanations. Instead, it offers layers of transmission that developed independently, sometimes overlapping, sometimes diverging, sometimes simply not intersecting in the same way again. And once those layers separate far enough, they begin to look like different stories, even if they originated from a shared early environment. There's also the way later frameworks reshape how earlier diversity is perceived. Once a canon is stabilized within a tradition, it creates a kind of internal reference point. Everything inside it feels foundational. Everything outside it feels additional, optional, or peripheral. But that classification only makes full sense inside that framework. Outside of it, the same material can be part of a different center entirely. So Enoch doesn't move from center to periphery in a universal sense. It moves relative to changing systems of organization, and those systems are not static. They evolve, solidify, and sometimes diverge across regions, which means the position of a text is never fixed in an absolute way. It is always relational, and relational positions change over time without requiring any dramatic event. There's also something important about how preservation itself works. Texts survive not only because they are valued, but because they are continuously handled, copied, read, taught, referenced. Each act of use reinforces their place in the system. When that cycle continues, stability follows naturally. When it slows, the text doesn't immediately disappear, but it becomes less anchored in active memory. And once anchoring weakens, even preserved texts can feel distant in later perception. That distance is often mistaken for loss, but it is really just reduced integration into the dominant flow of transmission. Enoch, in this sense, is not an exception to preservation. It is an example of how preservation can be uneven across different branches of tradition, still intact in some, less central in others, but always carried forward in some form, somewhere along the line. And when you step back far enough, the idea of it being hidden starts to feel less precise, because what you actually see is not concealment, it's distribution, different pathways holding different portions of an older shared world, some preserving more, some preserving less, but none fully breaking from the fact that it once existed within a broader textual landscape. And maybe that is the quietest realization in all of this, that nothing here was ever fully removed in a single decisive way. It simply moved, slowly, across time, until different parts of it became visible in different places. And Enoch, still present within those surviving lines, continues that movement even now, each time it is read again. There's something different about rediscovery compared to discovery. Discovery feels like finding something that was never fully seen before. Rediscovery feels more like realizing something was always there, just not in your line of sight for a while. The Book of Enoch in modern times often enters people's awareness through that second feeling, not as a sudden revelation from nowhere, but as something that surfaces again after being quiet for a long stretch of time in certain traditions. And that, again, matters, because it suggests continuity somewhere, even when familiarity has faded in others. In recent centuries, when scholars began comparing ancient manuscripts more carefully, Enoch started to reappear in discussions not as a myth or rumor, but as a preserved text with a traceable transmission history. Giez manuscripts played a key role in that recognition. They weren't fragments or vague references. They were full textual traditions that had been maintained within a living religious context, and that created a shift in perception, because suddenly, Enoch was not just something mentioned in passing in older sources. It was something still readable, still intact, still part of an ongoing tradition. That realization tends to change how people think about lost texts in general, because it reveals that loss is not always universal. Sometimes it is uneven awareness. A text can be fully present in one cultural and linguistic stream while being partially absent or less emphasized in another. And both conditions can exist at the same time without contradiction. Modern rediscovery often happens at the intersection of those streams. When scholars, translators, or readers encounter material that was preserved continuously in one tradition but not widely integrated into another, it creates a sense of surprise. Not because the text is new, but because it is newly visible within a different context. That shift in visibility is subtle but powerful. It changes the emotional framing of the text from forgotten to unfamiliar in this space, and that distinction matters. Because unfamiliarity invites curiosity, while perceived loss invites speculation, Enoch tends to attract both reactions depending on how it is encountered. There is also something important about how modern access changes interpretation. Once texts become widely available through translation and digital access, they are no longer bound to the slow, localized transmission patterns that shaped their earlier history. They enter a global interpretive space where they are read alongside many other traditions, often without the original contextual grounding that shaped their meaning in earlier communities. That can create new layers of interpretation, some grounded in historical study, some in comparative religion, some in broader cultural curiosity about ancient writings that sit outside familiar canonical structures. And in that broader space, Enoch often becomes a kind of focal point for questions about what was preserved, what was not, and why different traditions diverged in their textual boundaries. But those questions are not always answered by looking for a single cause, because rediscovery itself is not the reversal of loss. It is the meeting point of different preservation paths that were never fully aligned in the first place. One path continued uninterrupted within a tradition. Another path moved in a different direction, forming a separate textual center. And when those paths are brought back into conversation in modern times, it can feel like something is being recovered, when in reality, it was simply continuing elsewhere. There's also a quiet shift in how people relate to texts once they realize this. The sense of mystery changes shape. It becomes less about disappearance and more about divergence, less about what was taken away, more about what was never fully shared across all lines of transmission. And that shift softens some of the sharper assumptions that often surround the idea of hidden knowledge, because what emerges instead is a more ordinary, but still complex reality. Different communities preserving different parts of a shared early world, not always in sync, not always in contact, but still connected through origin. Enoch sits inside that connection, not as a lost artifact waiting to be found, but as a text that never stopped existing in certain places and only gradually returned to wider awareness in others. And that difference changes everything about how rediscovery actually feels. It's not the return of something gone, it's the expansion of what is now visible. There's a quiet shift that happens when a text stops being local and becomes widely accessible. It doesn't change the text itself, but it changes the way people relate to it. With Enoch, that shift is especially noticeable in modern times. Once translations became more available and scholarly work began comparing different manuscript traditions, the text moved into a kind of global conversation it had never fully been part of in the same way before. And in that space, it started being read without the same inherited boundaries that shaped it in earlier settings. That changes interpretation more than people usually realize, because when a text is read inside a tradition, it comes with context already attached. There are assumptions about how it should be understood, how it fits into a larger framework, what it is meant to do within that structure. But when it is read outside that framework, those assumptions fall away, and what remains is the raw structure of the text itself. That can feel both clearer and more uncertain at the same time. Clearer because there is less interpretive restriction, more uncertain because there is less interpretive guidance. Enoch, in this modern setting, often becomes a space where those two experiences overlap. Readers encounter it and notice how different it feels from more familiar canonical texts, not necessarily in content alone, but in tone, structure, and the way it moves through ideas without always pausing to define its own boundaries. And that difference invites reflection, sometimes curiosity, sometimes speculation, sometimes an attempt to place it into categories that didn't exist in the same form when it was originally preserved. That's where modern perception begins to diverge from historical transmission, because historical transmission wasn't trying to place Enoch into a global comparative category. It was preserving it within specific lines of tradition where its meaning was already embedded in practice and context. Modern reading, on the other hand, often places it alongside many other texts from different traditions and time periods, trying to understand it within a broader comparative framework. Both approaches are valid in their own way, but they produce different impressions. One sees continuity, the other sees difference, and difference often becomes the starting point for questions about why certain texts are more central in some traditions and less so in others. But those questions don't always lead to a single answer, because the answer is not located in one moment of decision. It is distributed across time, across language, across shifting patterns of use. There's also something important about how modern visibility changes the emotional tone of older texts. When something becomes widely accessible, it often gains a sense of immediacy that it didn't necessarily have in earlier contexts. It is no longer something encountered only within a specific tradition or community. It becomes something that can be read independently, outside of its original setting. And that independence changes how it feels. It becomes more open to interpretation, more open to comparison, more open to projection, which is part of why Enoch often becomes associated with broader ideas about hidden histories or suppressed knowledge in modern discourse, not because the text itself demands that framing, but because its uneven historical visibility across traditions creates space for that interpretation to form. When something is fully present in one place and less present in another, the mind naturally looks for reasons that explain the difference. And in the absence of a single clear explanation, imagination fills the space. But if you return to the transmission history itself, what you find is less a story of concealment and more a story of divergence that never fully reconverged. One line of tradition preserved it continuously. Others did not integrate it in the same central way as time went on, and modern rediscovery simply brings those lines back into contact, not to resolve them into one unified story, but to make their differences visible again. That visibility doesn't erase the history that came before it. It just reframes it, and in that reframing, Enoch becomes something slightly different again, not hidden, not lost, but layered across time in a way that only becomes fully noticeable when all those layers are seen together, still present, still readable, and still quietly shaped by every stage of transmission it passed through. There's a strange softness that comes at the end of long questions like this, not because everything is answered, but because your mind stops expecting it to be. With the Book of Enoch, by the time you reach this point in the story, it's no longer just about where the text came from or why it moved between traditions the way it did. It becomes something quieter, almost reflective in a different way. Because you start to notice that the word hidden doesn't quite fit anymore, not fully, not in the way it first sounded. What actually exists is something more ordinary and at the same time more complex. A text that continued in some places without interruption, while gradually becoming less central in others. A text that was never fully erased, but also never universally centered in the same way across all traditions. And both of those realities sit next to each other without resolving into one simple explanation. That's often how older history feels when you stop trying to force it into a single narrative. It doesn't collapse into a clear answer. It spreads out into layers of continuity. Enoch is still there in one of those layers, preserved, read, and treated as meaningful within traditions that carried it forward without breaking that line of transmission. And at the same time, it exists in other layers as something less central, less consistently present, shaped by different priorities as texts were organized into more defined structures over time. Neither of these versions cancels the other. They just describe different pathways the same text traveled through history. And when you hold both in mind at once, the idea of a single moment of removal starts to feel less precise. What remains instead is movement, slow movement through time, through language, through changing structures of belief and organization. There's also something quietly human in all of this that becomes easier to see the longer you sit with it. Texts don't move on their own. They move because people carry them, read them, choose them, teach them, or set them aside when other texts feel more aligned with what a community is trying to preserve. And none of those choices usually feel like dramatic turning points in the moment they happen. They feel practical, local, small. It's only later, when those small decisions accumulate across centuries, that they begin to look like historical shifts. And even then, they don't always point back to a single cause. They reflect many overlapping causes that never fully align into one line. So the Book of Enoch becomes less of a mystery in the sense of something lost or recovered, and more of an example of how texts live different lives depending on where they are carried. Some lives continuous, some lives fragmented, some lives parallel, but still connected at the origin. And when you step back far enough, that shared origin is the part that remains most stable. Everything after that is movement, not disappearance, not concealment, just the natural unevenness of how human transmission works over long periods of time. And maybe that is what stays with you most quietly. That nothing here needed to vanish completely to feel distant in some places. It only needed to move differently, and it did. And when you reach the final stretch of a story like this, it doesn't really feel like an ending in the usual sense. More like the noise in your mind slowly lowering until the ideas are still there, but they stop pushing for attention. The Book of Enoch doesn't resolve into a single explanation, and maybe it was never going to. Because texts like this don't survive, because they are neatly understood everywhere in the same way. They survive because they keep finding places where they can still be read, still be carried, still be meaningful enough for someone to copy them again instead of letting them disappear. And that's a very quiet kind of survival, not dramatic, not loud, just repeated human decisions across time. In some traditions, Enoch remained fully present, part of a continuous line of reading that never really broke. In others, it became less central, as different texts formed the core of what was regularly taught and preserved. And neither of those paths feels complete on its own when you look at them together. They only make sense as parts of a larger movement that didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly enough that most of the people involved probably never thought of it as a shift at all, just what was being read, what was being used, what was being passed forward. That's often how history actually feels when you get close to it, less like decisions, more like habits that last long enough to become structure. And once structure forms, it starts to feel natural, almost inevitable. Even if it was built from small, ordinary choices that no one fully saw as shaping the future at the time, Enoch sits inside that kind of structure now, not fully central in every tradition, not absent in others, but present in a way that reflects how uneven the past can be when it moves through different hands, languages, and priorities. And maybe that's where the quiet realization settles in, that hidden is not always the right word. Sometimes what we are really looking at is something that was simply carried differently, held in some places, let go in others, never fully gone, never fully uniform, just continuing in the lines where it remained useful, meaningful, or simply familiar enough to keep alive. And when you think about it like that, the distance between lost and present becomes smaller than it first seemed, not because everything becomes the same, but because the path between them turns out to be gradual, almost unnoticeable at each step, until you're only left with what still exists now, texts that remain, traditions that continue, and the quiet awareness that much of what we call history is really just the result of what was carried forward often enough to survive the silence between generations. And Enoch, in its own way, is still part of that ongoing movement, not finished, not closed, just still here in the places where it never stopped being read.